What a difference a single year can make. Last year, confident si Pangulong Duterte sa kanyang State of the Nation address. After all, his approval ratings were high. Sinabi pa nga niya na only 3% of Filipinos were disapproving of his performance. The Philippine economy was doing well, growing at between 6 to 7%, and his allies completely dominated the midterm elections. Sa Senado nga, walang opposition na nanalo, the worst performance since the Commonwealth era. As he enters his twilight years in office, he's also facing perhaps the greatest crisis of his presidency. These are his legacy years, so the question is, anong gagawin ni Pangulong Duterte to leave the best possible legacy para sa ating mga Pilipino? Now, balikan natin yung mga key points ng kanyang 4th State of the Nation address at talakayan natin whether he has met the targets that he set for himself confidently last year and what could be the challenges in the year ahead. First of all, yung poverty rates natin ay bumaba from around 27.6% in the first half of 2015 all the way down to 21% 3 years later. So the president enjoined the country to join him in a nationwide effort to defeat poverty. Pero ngayon, the economic picture looks tremendously bleak. First of all, yung dalawang leading survey agencies, Pulse Asia and SWS, are yet to release the approval and satisfaction rating of the president for this year. Pero base sa mga proxy or similar surveys that we have seen, mukhang the situation is not looking very good either for the president and for the country. For instance, in the social weather stations quality of life trend, the Philippines is facing the worst situation on the record, at least when it comes to the SWS surveys. The International Monetary Fund also revised the Philippines' economic growth downwards. Mukhang close to 4% contraction ang makikita natin sa ating gross domestic product. In short, the Philippines is facing the worst economic prospect since the time of Marcos dictatorship. Pangalawa, the president talked about the drug problem and how he has been pushing for elimination of drugs from the Philippine streets. Now, kung maalala natin, the president actually hired Vice President Leni Robredo temporarily as the anti-drug czar. Only weeks after, he fired her because of disagreements on approaches to move forward. Ito na nga, 5th year na ni Pangulong Duterte, but it's not very clear, based on data and evidence, whether we're truly defeating the drug menace in our country. Pangatlo, throughout the years, from his election campaign and throughout his presidency, si Pangulong Duterte and his supporters have constantly attacked the previous administration for their mishandling or supposed mismanagement of the Yolanda crisis and the subsequent reconstruction of the devastated areas. And yet the president also has not done very well, perhaps even worse, when it comes to reconstruction of Marawi, which by the way was not destroyed by natural calamities, but destroyed because of a long-drawn counterinsurgency war. Many would say that under better leadership, perhaps the Philippines would not have had a siege of Marawi to begin with by a bunch of ragtag terrorists, not to mention it did not have to last for 5 long months. At the end of 2017, the president promised to make Marawi beautiful again. And yet, ito na nga, more than 2 years since the end of the Marawi siege, there's not much development on the ground. So it's true that 3.56 billion pesos was allocated to the rehabilitation and reconstruction of Marawi, but we need to see greater sense of urgency. Papatapos na ang Duterte presidency. Next, the president talked about corruption and his efforts to rid the country of corruption. Wag natin kalimutan, during his presidential campaign, he did not only say that he's gonna fight against drug, pero sabi niya hindi rin maging corrupt yung kanyang administration and he's gonna get rid of corrupt people. Even a whiff of corruption will be enough to fire people. And yet, ang nakita natin sa Duterte administration is constant recycling of previously fired officials, whether for corruption charges or suspicions of inefficacy and abuse of power. So instead of really getting rid of corruption, what we saw was recycling. So based on the Corruption Perception Index, the Philippines actually dropped by 14 notches, now ranking 113th in the world. Now the president also talked about raising the salary of teachers and improving our educational institutions. Kasama dyan is yung alternative schooling system and academy for sports initiatives. The problem is that because of the pandemic, enrollment has dropped by more than 20%, and the situation can get worse depending on how we handle the COVID-19 pandemic. And there are no indications that salary and compensation para sa ating mga guro will improve anytime soon. Next, the president talked about the West Philippine Sea and his efforts to find a cooperative and balanced relationship with China. Now, in fairness, Over the past year, the president, or at least his administration, for the very first time after 4 years, made it very clear to China that the arbitration award or arbitral tribunal award in 2016 in the South China Sea is final and binding. Dapat sumunod ng China, and that is non-negotiable ayon kay Foreign Affairs Secretary Chidoro Locsin. That was a dramatic escalation on the part of the Philippines' reassertion of its rights in the West Philippine Sea, not to mention Defense Secretary Lorenzana also pushing ahead with rehabilitation of our facilities dyan sa Pag-asa. And of course, the president even had to reverse his decision of abrogating the Visiting Forces Agreement, most likely in order to secure the Philippines' interest amid China's brazen strategic opportunism in the South China Sea amid the global pandemic. But perhaps the biggest issue when it comes to the president's fifth SONA and in his last years in office ay yung pag-handle sa COVID-19 pandemic. And in the meantime, the government has been utang, borrowing right and left from international financial institutions to strengthen our fiscal capacity to respond. Umaabot ng almost 9.6 trillion pesos ang ating utang. So let's hope the government will use the borrowed money in the best way possible to manage the COVID-19 crisis and push forward an effective recovery program. The fifth SONA of President Duterte, lots to discuss and a lot of challenges ahead. These are the legacy years of President Duterte, so he has a lot to prove or to fix before he steps down from office. Ako po si Richard Hidarian. Stand with us, stand for truth.